Dr. Qasim, and I'm going to today talk about African economic outlook and prospects. Uh, Particularly if we recall our last list of lectures, and we was talking about global investment and global economic conditions. One of the student asked me to give an overview about African economies and outlooks and prospects. So we will have a two series of lecture. This one is more towards economic outlook and prospects, and the next would be the investment opportunities in African economic countries and system. So let me uh, talk about the agenda of today's session. Basically, we will start with polycrisis and Africans' position in that scenario. We will talk about the global polycrisis context. We will talk about the trade potential of African countries. We will obviously give some key takeaways and recommendations, and that how resilience and vulnerable strategies can capitalize on these opportunities, and then certain conclusion and policy actions. So let's start with through which we will start our main issue, that is basically global polycrisis context. Now, before we start, one thing is very for sure, if we look about particularly the African countries, their economic outlook, their economic conditions, so we need to understand the concept of polycrisis. We know like different type of crisis, right? Financial crisis, uh, there are health crisis, climate issues, and so on. But what exactly is polycrisis? So we will start with defining the polycrisis. It refers to simultaneous interconnected crisis. It's not like a certain single crisis, but simultaneously there are different crises and they are interconnected and they are happening like again and again, and there are a lot of list of crises that are happening over there. This concept of a series of crises be simultaneously and interconnected, that is basically the concept of polycrisis. Now, these crises can be economic, can be climate, can be social, can be demographical, can be political, can be technology, and can be a lot. You can name the list of crises, and if they are occurring simultaneously and they are interconnected, that is the concept of polycrisis. Now, what happened that these crises amplify each other's. So one is pushing other and leading to deeper impacts. So that is the how polycrises are very harmful to the economies. Particularly and especially African region is especially vulnerable due to fragile system and global dependencies that make this global crisis and pushing African countries into a very deeper impacts. And two important things, the fragile system and global dependencies. We will talk about how these two issues are pushing African countries towards this crisis. I will just share you some statistics that our 40 African countries had inflation above 10% in 2023, according to IMF report. So you see one of the economic condition, one of the economic crisis, right? Other than other crises as well. One another statistics that shows that 160 million plus people in sub-Saharan African countries faced food insecurity. Again, a crisis is there. Either that is economic, that is health, that is food crisis, or whatever. So it's mean if we have a series of issues, that is the polycrisis. Now, how global polycrisis context is developing in African. So many African nations are in debt distress. One of the major issue that these countries, we were talking about the dependency of these African countries on international uh, institutions or international governments. Tax distress, a lot of debt is there. You have to pay your debt, you have to pay interest payment and so on. So all the time you are either in gray list, you are either in blacklist or some sort of thing. You are near to default, you are near to bankrupt. So that is basically whenever we are having certain debt, so there is always a distress of debt that is linked. Now, what happened to this thing is it will reduce development capacity. If you are all the time serving your debt, so obviously the developmental capacity of the country, of the nation will reduce. And secondly, heavily reliance on commodity increases exposure to global shocks. Let's say if we talk about the Ukraine war, so mainly the commodities and the food items, the wheat is basically if the countries that have higher reliance on these commodities and global shocks are there, the global wars are going on. So obviously that will push to regional issues as well. 23 African countries at high risk are in debt distress. So that shows that there are a lot of crises that are happening within this. So we are in the domain of poly crisis. So Ghana's public debt reached 88% of GDP in 2023. So it's mean that country is all the time is facing debt stress. It's experiencing reduced development. The capacity of development is decreasing, high risk. So all these things are happening. So the nations are in poly crisis, the one crisis and followed by another crisis. 75% of African exports are commodities. And if there are certain global shocks on commodities, so a lot of crises are happening all around the world. And all the crises are interconnected and they are happening simultaneously. Putting forward, African contributes only 4% of the global emission, but suffers a major climate impact. It's mean they are not harming, but they are suffering from whatever the climate changes is happening globally. Infrastructure weakness limit adoption and services in order to tackle the climate changes and climate impact. And then only 43% on African have access to electricity. The one more crisis. People have no energy crisis. The energy crisis is there. 300% increase in climate disasters since 1980s. So climate disaster is happening within the African countries. The drought issue that displaced 2.7 million people in 2023. The food issue, scarcity of the food. So if now I list the global context, the debt issue, economic issue, energy issue, climate issue, a lot of crises are happening, and that lot of crises, if they are happening and they are interconnected, we are in the domain of poly crisis. Now, if I ask you one thing, that why African are more vulnerable to poly crisis compared to other regions of the world, obviously this question is coming, that if I'm explaining you 2 or 3 slides that this is happening within the African countries, so this question is coming to your minds. Why? Why Africa is more vulnerable to poly crisis compared to other regions in the world, as compared to Gulf region, as compared to Asia, as compared to American, Latin American, is as compared to Europe, right? So this question, we will try to address this question in today's discussion as well. So maybe at the end of the day, I will asking you this question: that what is your understanding that why Africa is more vulnerable to poly crisis compared to other regions of the world? So keep this thing in your mind. I will ask this question at the end of my lecture as well. Today, I'm going to ask you this question. Now, let's explain, like we are going in depth now that we want to try, we try to find some issues. The World Uncertainty Index, that is basically trades political and economic uncertainty and measure that how much uncertainty is happening. This is one of the biggest issue. So according to that report, which is issued by World Uncertainty Index, that tracks political and economic certainty. So we can see that since 2012, uncertainty has increased significantly, and major spikes have been observed during 2014 to 2016, where oil prices dropped. And then 2029 to 2020, that is the era of pandemic happening, COVID, coronavirus, again, one of the crisis that is happening, right? So that has emerged, that uncertainty is increasing, and particularly within this region. And global uncertainty affect all region, but Africa faces more severe impacts. This is global uncertainty. So globally, overall, the oil prices shock, the pandemic has affected the all the global countries globally. But if we compare again with African countries, so global uncertainty has affected more to this region. And now, why? Like, if the question is arising that why uncertainties and risk perception in Africa is different? Why, according to World Uncertainty Index, African level are consistently above the global averages. So they are high, they are more vulnerable, they are exposed to more uncertainty, and risk is there. If there is more uncertainty, keep in mind this thing that the risk would be high. That is the phenomena of uncertainties. Now, there are few factors that is contributing towards this issue. The domestic political shocks, e.g. the coups and conflicts. You people are aware about these coups and conflicts that is happening as a political shocks, domestic level. And then natural disaster and climate vulnerabilities, the climate change, natural disasters, and then low capacity to manage external economic and political shocks. We will talk about that, how these political shocks are happening and what are the different type of these shocks. And then increased global interconnectedness has aligned African uncertainty spike with global events. That now the economies are interconnected. So if something is happening in Russia, if something is happening in Ukraine, the war is going on, that is affecting the African economy as well, because of the interconnected, because of the trade agreements between different regions and that global trade. So that leads more uncertainty and risk perception in Africa. Now, when I was talking about that, what is basically the political or domestic shocks? So now we will talk about the different type of shocks. These are the shocks that is basically affecting the major African countries. First of all, the most important one is political shocks. Africa is highly exposed to political shocks, and that includes political uncertainty and mass protest that is happening across the different nations. Erosion of political freedoms and accountability. That if there is lack of political freedoms, there is lack of accountability. There are certain threats to human rights protections that is contributing towards political shocks, and coups and violent conflict that is happening within that region. According to UN Secretary General 2021, an explosion of power by force in African. These are the sort of conflicts that is happening. And then since 1950 to 492 coups globally occurred in Africa. So that shows the political shocks, the coups, the violence, the conflict, uncertainty, the accountability, the mass protest that is happening, and that is basically affecting the whole economies within this region. 45 out of 54 African countries have experienced at least one coup in last 50 years. So that are the issue, that are the shocks that is basically contributing towards the poly crisis that we are talking about. Ultimately, the one poly shocks and political shocks will contribute to poly crisis as well. And then the economic shocks. Africa has long been exposed to external economic shocks. If we talk about 1980s and 1990s, there is structural adjustment program SAPS that is tied to IMF and World Bank loans, right? So we see that if we are more exposed to external economic shocks, so whatever is happening in terms of policies of IMF, in terms of policies of World Bank loans, so that is going to affect the African countries in terms of structural adjustment programs. So IMF and World Bank, these institutions are basically coming up with adjustment programs, their economic policies, and they are intervening in the policy making process of the government. So that is obviously is one of the shock that is exposed to external shock. And then recent major shocks that includes commodity price boom. These are the external shocks, economic, global financial crisis. We people are aware about that in 2008 and 9 in US, a global financial crisis had occurred. The boom of the credit was there, and certainly there were a flop of lot of mortgage companies and other financial institutions. So that has affected the all the financial institution globally, and particularly the banking sector. And then the global context of COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, 19 and onward, that has affected the all the region, irrespective of Africa, Asia, Gulf countries, European, US, whatever, American, Latin American, all region have been affected. So obviously there is a lot of research has been doing that how pandemic has affected economies, and obviously the pricing, the inflation, right? So a lot of issues was there. So that is going to affect an external thing that is out of the control of the local governments or local region. And then high inflation in 2022. It is noticed that these African countries are facing high inflation. We have seen the context of Ghana, higher global interest rates as well. It's not like the only African is facing this thing. The globally high inflation is existing. Obviously, now how this global interest rate, high global rate, is going to affect the Africa. Obviously, more African countries are suffering from debt crisis. So that will increase the debt servicing cost. And the debt servicing cost is basically the interest. We pay more interest. Now, if interest rate is increasing, now we are paying more in terms of interest. The servicing cost will increase, and that is going to affect your economy as well. And then currency depreciation risk. This is one of the biggest issue that the global organization are facing. The currency depreciation risk. Currency is depreciating, inflation is there, value of the money is decreasing over the period of time. You cannot buy dollars. The dollar is getting expensive. So these are the certain issue that is affecting the economic, that is contributing to economic shocks. The next issue is energy shocks. African countries are vulnerable due to the low access to global energy supply. There is limited energy infrastructure. And obviously, energy is needed to fuel economic growth. Remember, if you want to have an economic growth and you want to grow in terms of economy, you need energy resources. That is the fuel of growth. So if you don't have that much access and you have very limited infrastructure, in limited resources, obviously it will affect your economic growth. So energy shock is one of the issues that will contribute to the holy crisis as well. And energy is important for industrialization and development, research and development. In order to put your company, in order to put your country on an industrial platform, and you want to grow in terms of industry, you are developing new products and services. So obviously, this industrialization and development would be something that is uh, uh, based on energy. So energy is needed to fuel that economic growth and industrialization and development. And what happen if we have a very limited risk? And what is happening if energy crises are happening? There are certain risks that is associated with energy shocks. Energy cost is unaffordable and unreliable energy availability is there. Now, obviously, if we have certain issues, shocks, we have identified that these are the vulnerability is about to this thing, why energy is needed, what are the possible risks. So obviously, there are certain opportunities. We can untap the renewable energy potential like the solar, the wind, the hydropower, but obviously there is certain limited infrastructure in terms of solarization, in terms of wind generation, or in terms of hydropower energy. So energy, renewable energy resources need to be untapped. The more focus should be on there. I will just share you one thing that over 190 billion dollar is required annually to address these risks and energy needs, like the solar, the wind, or renewable energy, in order to boost your economic, in order to boost your industry and development, and so on. So this much shows that this energy crisis is shocks is one of the most important thing that is contributing towards poly crisis. We were talking about the global uncertainty index. You can see what is happening to this thing, the African, and then the comparison of the world. If we can see this African, this color, and world with dotted blue, you can see a lot of event is happening. The Gulf War starting from 1990, although it doesn't affect it that much to the Africa and global world. But what is happening? United States of America recession that take place on 11 September to 2001. So that is how African region is more connected during this period. You see, there is a high upward trend of uncertainty. Then Iran-Iraq war outbreak, this time period of then Federal Reserve System tightening, political risk in Greece and Ukraine, this region, the Brexit issue, the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19, trade tensions between China and US in terms of Brexit. So that crisis in Europe, financial credit crunch, that is financial crisis of 2008, and geopolitical tensions and collapse of Silicon Valley, bank signature and credit of. So if we can see the number of events are happening, this graph is basically talk about the number of events are happening and the uncertainty index is increasing. You see, uncertainty index is increasing. Obviously, whenever we have Africa is more as compared to the world global uncertainty index. So that is more vulnerable according to this scenario. Okay, one question again. Now, keep in mind this question that which African country is considered the least exposed to political shocks? I will ask you this question. So you can kindly note the second question for today's related issue, that which African country is considered the least exposed to political shocks? My first question was about holy crisis as well. So that was the whole scenario that what we were talking about, what we were having discussing, that how different issues are prevailing in these African regions. Now, how we can unlock the African trade potential, like boosting regional markets and reducing risk. This is the basically the ultimate goal that what the policymakers are looking forward. The reporter focused basically on the strategies for African countries and the private sector to mitigate trade risk from the global poly crisis. So this is the strategy according to the report, that African countries should invest in private sector. They should involve private sector to mitigate trade risk from the global poly crisis. So the global shocks will be less towards Africa. And then optimization of regional market benefits to strengthen market resilience. Now, this is very much important, that rather than the developmental theories that shows that if we always looking towards the developed economies, so maybe according to capitalist approach, there are a lot of issues. So why not the regional market should integrate it? And they should be in the form that will be provided market resilience to all the other region. So I'm talking about the regional markets, so it's been particularly the African markets. There should be cross uh, strengthening. There should be regional benefits that each country is can get from other countries as well. And then exploration of diverse trade risk rather than going for a certain economic, political, environmental, energy, technology, logistics. So a lot of diverse trade risks are there. And we need to explore these diverse trade risks in order to mitigate the overall risk of the region, basically. Now, the key takeaways or recommendations are basically the economic diversification. Essential buffer should be maintained against economic shocks. We have talked about there are a lot of reasons that why economic shocks are happening, especially for economic dependent on a limited number of trade partners. So you have to increase your trade, the economic shocks would be less, and you need to come up with a buffer, essential buffers against these shocks. So these shocks is will not going to affect your region, or particularly the certain markets in that region as well. So and you're obviously that is one of the sign that if you can buffer against economic shocks, the economic development would be high. So economic diversification is required in order to get out of these poly crises. Then again, this thing is very important, that regional integration and value added chains must be there. African integration into high value added segments of the global supply chain remains low. The reason is that African have a lot of resources they are available with them, but a lot of the companies they are coming, and due to the cheap labor, due to the low cost of factor of production, right? So global supply chain there that remains very low as compared to the regional integration, rather than so internal supply chain of the African regions that need to be integrated into value added segments. So regional integration, all the African countries, they are coming up with certain supply chain, and then they are exporting, or they are exporting to the global regions. So they are, that is how they are expanding their global supply chains. Better infrastructure and leveraging the African continental free trade areas, ECFTA, that is termed as the African Continental Free Trade Area, can improve regional market participation. So this is how the regional infrastructure and regional trade association, free trade, like let's say the, if we can take the example of European Union, right? So what European Union have done basically, they have a free trade area, free currency, free parliament, like, so they have declared they have come up with an regional integration. All the 27 European countries are there, and EU members, they enjoy certain benefits. The EU countries, they are enjoying certain benefits by via leveraging these very improved regional market participation. So this is one of the phenomenal things that can affect the regional integration and value chains of African region. And although that is launched in 2021, the African Continental Free Trade Area is a crucial step towards economic integration. And if it can work together, the African countries, they can come up with this integration. And this integration is obviously one of the buffer that protect this African region from the global shocks, from the global issues, from the global pandemic, and so on, right? So this is how the regional integration is very important uh, in terms of value chain integration, and in terms of protecting your country from these global shocks and holy crises. Now, there are few other recommendations, that improving operational environment for the business. What is required basically, improved operational environment for the business. Now, SMEs, small and medium enterprises, and micro enterprises are very vital aspect for business development. So, as an environment of the business, we have to keep in mind this thing, that we have to come up with the policies that we need to boost these micro enterprises and SMEs. Less than 50% of the population has reliable electricity access, increasing cost and limiting value chain integration. This is one of the issues. We need to improve that operational environment for the business. We need to come up with reliable electricity access. We need to provide them. That will boost ultimately the operational environment for the business, because energy is the fuel for these very businesses in order to operate these industries, the micro enterprises and SMEs. So this is how we can improve the operational environment for the business, providing reliable energy resources to these businesses and enterprises and industries. And the focus should be on the growth in renewable energy investment. In Africa is very low compared to the global investment of 2.3% of total. So again, we lack in terms of renewable energy, like the solarization, the hydropower, the wind. So these are the renewable energy resources. That is again one of the most important thing in terms of improving the operational environment of the business. And then addressing economic uncertainty. Holy crisis discourage trade and investment, obviously, and hamper long-term development. This is one of the biggest issue of economic uncertainty, this holy crisis. So we need to we need to increase foreign direct investment to African, and that has declined by 3% in 2023. The reason is basically that holy crisis. So they are interconnected. If there are poly crises, it will discourage trade and investment, and we can see FDI is decreasing. So what we have to do, we have to come up of these poly crises, different strategies. And what will happen? The foreign direct investment to African region will be high, will be increased. And obviously, that is one of the tool for further economic development and industrialization. So obviously, these poly crises have certain negative impact on investment and trades. And then deeper regional integration that we have already talked about can reverse this trend with African investor funding 13 to 20% of international projects in African last year. So African investors are now investing in the projects, African projects, rather than the foreign investor is investing. So that increase the flow of funds. So that is only possible for a regional integration. So the more regional integration would be high, it will increase that the local African investor, they are investing in investment projects, maybe they are investing in renewable energy projects, maybe they are investing in SMEs, maybe they are investing in micro enterprises. So this is how regional integration will be one of the most important thing in terms of addressing the economic uncertainty. But is the policy recommendation for African governments that they need to enhance the legal and regulatory environment? We already know the importance of legal and regulatory environment. This is the key. And the weakened legal and regulatory environment is obviously going to affect the whole uh, country in terms of politics, in terms of economy, in terms of law and order. Each and everything is based on a strong legal and regulatory system, a strong enforcement system. If your system is more enforced, the legal system is unbiased, the regulations are unbiased, and they are working up to the maximum level. Obviously, the crisis, the international shocks, either that is political, the poly crisis would be minimum. So legal and regulatory environment is very important in terms of addressing these issues. And then leveraging the robust risk management tools against the pandemic 2019. So there should be the robust risk management. If COPs are there, if conflicts are there, if regional conflicts are there, the robust risk management system should be there. How to tackle the food insecurity, how to tackle the renewable energy issue. These are the certain risks that this region is. So the leveraging the robust, technical, sound, up to mark, up to date risk management tools can protect this region from these global shocks. And obviously, once again, promoting regional cooperations. This is really very important in terms of African as a unit, African as a one um, region. They need to promote the regional cooperation. This regional cooperation will ultimately mitigate all the crises. It will reduce the poly crisis and obviously the economic, the political, the energy and other resources via mutual agreement, via mutual sharing that can protect the countries as well. Strategic investment in infrastructure and technology. Now, obviously, if we have done our the system is more legal and regulatory, that is well established. Risk management tools are there and regional cooperation is there. Obviously, it will attract now investment. So strategic investment is required in terms of infrastructure, in terms of technology, in terms of energy. Obviously, it will smooth the trade and improve connectivity among the African region. So these are the key takeaways for African governments as a policy recommendation to tackle these poly crises. Few other strategies and resilience strategies. detailed vulnerability. We have talked about the economic vulnerability, that impact of global shocks on commodity dependent countries. Remember this thing, economic vulnerability is more for the countries that have commodity dependent rather than they are industry dependent, right? So if they are commodity dependent countries, and Africans are obviously commodity dependent countries. Governance vulnerability to risk, change in security, challenge in insecurity, rule of law, rights, inclusion strategies, inclusion rules and regulations. So governance is going to affect. And so these are all the challenges that all the government is facing, obviously, irrespective of either they are African, they are any other region. So they're all facing these challenges in security, how to make security of the country, of the nation, the rule of law, the rights, legal rights, rights of individuals, and the inclusion, like the gender inclusion, the diversity, and other issues, and connectivity vulnerability, dependency on external factors like fuel prices and trade route disruptions, and importance of improving logistic services and infrastructure that need to be. Connectivity is one of the most important issues, that we need to, that logistic services and infrastructure must be interconnected, either from a regional perspective or from a global perspective. So these fuel prices and trade routes disruptions, they're obviously going to affect the connectivity of different regions, like the trade, let's say the oil trading, the oil trade uh, from different regions to Africa, from Africa to different regions. They are commodities, so connectivity, and if there is a certain disruption in terms of trade routes, obviously it will affect the connectivity. Obviously, it will affect the fuel prices. They are interconnected markets. So we need to come up with social vulnerabilities as well. Countries with highest and lowest social vulnerability based on social progress index. The European economies are now facing this social vulnerability issue as compared to African. Then energy vulnerability, limited access to global energy supply, high energy poverty, challenges in transition to renewable sources, that we are moving from transition to renewable sources. So energy vulnerability is there. And obviously the climate change, significant economic damage due to climate shocks and financing challenges. And you need to come up with the new strategies that how this climate change issue must be addressed, and a lot of resources are required for that thing. This is the how the commodities and other market has affected historical view of shocks. There are different shocks. We are talking about the global shocks, the other things. So this is the commodity price boom. This commodity price boom has affected. You see, this is how the annual percentage change is happening. GDP. GDP is increasing and decreasing trend. But obviously, if we see here, a lot of decrease over there. This region, this commodity price decline. This is the time period of obviously after the Arab Spring, global financial crisis, and you see there is a decreasing trend, but soon after the effect of Arab Spring that started in 2012, Arab Spring, a lot of issues and crises that affected the oil prices and oil shocks received. The GDP has decreased, and commodity price decline, one of the issue after Arab Spring, it is start happening. So you see there is a decreasing trend till 2020. There is, and then upward push, and then pandemic, pandemic also has affected a downward trend. So this is how the global shocks are very vulnerable to African countries. If we talk about the economic merchandise exports of Africa, we see the petroleum, oil, and crude oil is basically the top of the merchandise that African countries are exporting billion of dollars. So that is above $80 billion is basically the African merchandise export. There are gold, platinum, copper, petroleum oils, petroleum gases, diamonds, motor cars, iron, not that much, but the majority of the African merchandise export is basically petroleum oils. Similarly, interestingly, the leading African merchandise import is also petroleum oil, other than the crude oil, and then motor cars and passengers, petroleum oil, crude, medicines, wheat, and uh, telephone, petroleum gases, rice, and so on. So these are the different imports and exports. Now, what is the required is basically the fiscal adjustment and macroeconomic sustainability is required. Redistribution of wealth. Fiscal policy objective must be. So we need to come up with fiscal policy, the financial policy of the government by the treasury. Redistribution of the wealth. Undistribution of the wealth is obviously one of the issue that is affecting the countries and all the countries basically. Regulation the harmful activities. Any fictitious activities, any harmful activities must be regulated, and provision of public goods. And we need to address the risk of the government, the less than optimal adjustments. So economic effect must be taken. So that one of the key indicator of fiscal risk, both fiscal deficit and flow of total government as a stock. So fiscal risk is basically increasing as well. Macroeconomic sustainability. So these are the how we are resilient. We can come back. How we can come back of these crises. We need to enhance stability to lower economic vulnerability on shocks via macroeconomic stability, via macroeconomic policies, via optimizing regional market opportunities, reducing trade-related risk and through regional trade networks, and strengthening institutional and organizational settings in terms of robust risk management practices and cross-border transaction. So this is how we can be more resilient, that we can again come up. So overall summary is interconnected global countries are there, and that one crisis is basically affecting the whole global and prospect of the world, and in particularly the African vulnerability is high. So we need to emphasize on collaboration between policymakers and businesses to build resilient economic, trade, financial, economic system for strong crisis preparedness and response. So the crisis is not an issue, but we need to come up with a proper plan to address these issues and to mitigate these risks. So this is all about today's discussion. Thank you very much. Now,
Thank you very much, Professor Syed Shah.
okay,
Ladies and
but before we start your question answer session, I will ask you, why is Africa is more vulnerable to poly crisis compared to other regions of the world? At the end of the lecture, at the end of this class, if you can take this issue and you are clear about this issue, then obviously the purpose is fulfilled, right? We have talked about the poly crisis. I put this question, that's why that poly crisis is there and why Africa is more vulnerable. Though that was the key issue that we are addressing today and considering the whole African issue. I have one more question. Okay, who can answer this question that which African country is considered least exposed to political shocks? Anyone? And then you can ask question answer session as well. Yes.